Hi, it's Lunamos, and welcome to the first episode of Retroscope. In this series, I'm going to do game review and story recapitulation of games that may not be discussed or even seen in lots of Western context. As a Chinese living in Japan making English videos, I felt some obligation to do the job. So why don't we just talk about my plans later and get started right now with today's topic, Chinese Paladin, The Legend of Sword and Fairy. I would call it Sword and Fairy for short. Released by Dayü Zixun or Soft Star in Taiwan in 1995, it is by far one of the most influential titles produced originally in Chinese language. We can even call it the most influential, without one of if we consider its historic position. And here I'm using the Steam version and a fan translation by Nostalgided, and thank you very much for bringing this special game to a wider audience. I'm not familiar with how people received the game in Taiwan that time, so I will be talking from a mainland China's perspective where I grew up. So let me show you some numbers and facts about Sword and Fairy to show how influential it becomes after its release. And there is a reader's voting session in the most widely circulated PC gaming magazine, 大众软件 or PopSoft. Sword and Fairy. This game appeared in the ranking list from 1995 and it ranked top 1 for several years straight. And it stayed in the top 10 ranking until 2002. That angry editors of the magazine just begged their readers and suggest them to stop voting these games and move on. Look at those games below, StarCraft, Diablo, the classics of almost all PC gamers from around the world. But they cannot even match the votes that Sword and Fairy got. And another thing I'd like to share about is its high priority in a default PC setting in mainland China. And speaking of software popularity, we must not forget piracy. The legal copy of Sword and Fairy sold around 160 to 180 yuan. But according to statistics, the average monthly income of urban residents in 1995, 324 yuan. Can you imagine spending half of your monthly income for one copy of a video game? Yes, piracy is wrong, but I cannot blame people too much for piracy during these years. Lots of people are not feeling good about it, so a lot of people also start buying the game years later when they can afford it. Soon, the illegal copy became so viral that it's even installed as a default software in a compatible PC machine. I remember that when you buy your own PC during the late 90s, the store owner will install some softwares for you so they can save some effort by just including lots of stuff anyway. So the most popular one is WPS or CCED, and both of them are basically similar to Microsoft Word for word processing, which is essential for most PC buyers that day. The second is Red Alert, which released 1 year later, and the third on the list would be our Sword and Fairy. I'm not even sure if there is a corresponding RPG in Japan or in the West that's similar to this. Maybe consider what Dragon Quest means to Japanese people or some PC essentials like Doom to Westerners. Only more, you will not make a phone call to the PC store like, "Hey, customer service, I cannot find Doom on my new PC. Is it broken?" Well, it's just that popular in China. Now let's talk about the game itself. The game was released on MS-DOS for IBM-compatible machine, and it has a remake for Sega Saturn console release. But it's not well received by critics and players, considering that a 1995 game released in 1999 is quite natural. Most mainlanders like me played the DOS version or the later enhanced 95 version for better compatibility on Windows. Back in 1995, it's a totally different world. 3D still looks like a mess. And most 2D games are struggling to fill themselves in 32 megabits cartridges. Sword and Fairy is born just at the right time spot. I would not say that the graphics are one of the best, but it's certainly worth talking about. The game is isometric, which I think is not so often used in JRPG of that era. It's not actually easy to deal with in development. Some other examples including Sega's Landstalker and Quest's Tactics Ogre. They also used a similar projection. The resolution of the game is 320 by 200, which is of course not the best among PC games in 1995. The standard resolution for PC 98 games in Japan is 640 by 400, 4 times more. But still, it's acceptable as 16-bit console games with fewer pixel count are still dominating the market. This is a trade-off actually for the balance between static and dynamic art. Developers prefer more dynamic animations to be filled in a few floppy disks, so a lower resolution is chosen. They also saved manpower and resources for the scenario writing and gameplay part. Look at the pixel art here. They have lower resolution but still looks fantastic. Dynamic butterfly sprites flying around flowers, fishing with this very vivid presentation of the characters' movement and expressions. Towns filled with ancient Chinese sculptures, building, Eastern-style decorations, clothing and accessories. They are just a totally different world construction compared with Western and most Japanese fantasy art style. Some scenes in the game world reminds me of Chinese painting art, which is a very special ancient art that's excellent in landscape painting. It's like a dream come true to see lots of art style with Chinese culture elements that I've been familiar with from my childhood to be presented as a video game on the screen of a computer. Dayu Company already did this many times actually. In 1994, their 轩辕剑 2 already had wonderful pixel art, and Sword and Fairy takes a step further and implemented even better result. Speaking of pixel graphics, there are hundreds of different enemies and each has their attacking animation. Yes, attacking animation. It's even ahead of Final Fantasy of that era, which did not have enemy animation at all until Final Fantasy VII. Of course, they had the storage trade-off consideration, but this animation surely enhanced the look and feeling during the battle. The boss art, I'd say that it may not be better than, but at least on par with Final Fantasy. Just look at this guy. Can you imagine how excited the players were back in 1995 when fighting this Zhen Yumin Wang to save the loved one from the abyss of Demon Tower? And the battlefield can even be changed by different magic and martial art animation. Character portraits art is another highlight of the graphics. You also see lots of characters' dialogue boxes with a big and fancy portrait. These kind of portraits are often seen in Japanese adventure games, but are not so common in a lot of console JRPGs at that time. Most of the game will not show such a depiction, but just let the sprite do the job. I remembered Phantasy Star 4 used a similar philosophy of character portraits. I just love this high-quality dialogue performance. Combined with sprite animation, created a better understanding of the characters' look and behaviors, which makes them even harder to forget. If you could not stand playing the low-res version from today's point of view, there is an official remake of the game released for Windows XP. Though the pixel art is also beautiful, but it's already 2001. We've seen games that are much more cooler, like Final Fantasy X or Baldur's Gate 2. So this kind of looks is a little bit mediocre from the perspective of 2001 players, so less impact but easier to begin with. Let's talk about gameplay. If you're familiar with the beloved genre JRPG, then you'll be at home with the game's process and battle system. Unlike many classic JRPGs, the whole game is basically linear, without an open world to explore freely. But instead, the in-game map is just huge. You will be walking step by step from one town to another, viewing the beautiful scene and feeling the distance. If you know the famous JRPG from 1994, The Legend of Hero 3, it's a similar implementation of world map. To me, I think this adds some sense of adventure, but still, lack of a world map and the linear progression of the game might be a reason why the console version of the game is not rated very high by critics from Japan. In the map, you'll have random encounters and enter the battle, but thank God you can see encounters on the map, which I personally considered a good practice. The instruction-based battle system is, I'd say, average quality. You choose from attacking, 仙术, blocking, using items, or retreating from a menu. 仙术 is actually a combination of Chinese martial art and Western fantasy magic concept in the game. Each 仙术 has pretty good animation. They are just similar to the different levels of elemental magic in Final Fantasy games. The highest level of 仙术 looks like summons in Final Fantasy that causes significant AoE damage. Some enemies are just weak against certain element, which serves as the main strategy part of the battle. Another highlight of the battle system is the use of item. You can throw most of the weapon as a one-time dart to cause great damage. This derives some speedrunning playstyle. The game did not provide a Final Fantasy-like job system, so it's kind of easy to exploit all possibilities of the battle system, and soon the game becomes maybe easy as long as you grind for a long time in the dungeon. Speaking of dungeon, the dungeon of the game is quite difficult. I mean the dungeon itself. Enemies are not so strong, and you can get immediate HP and MP recovery after each battle, which made dungeon crawling much easier. But the size of the dungeons is so large and the puzzle often so lame, so it's extremely easy to get lost in the dungeon. If you are familiar with classic CRPGs like Wizardry, then the form of the dungeon looks like an isometric version of that. Except that they are less fun to play. You don't have to plan your resources because of the recovery mechanics. You don't have character builds to worry about because, well, there's no job system for each character. The puzzle of the dungeon is cliché, and brute force is often the best practice in solving them. All you have to do is to find the right way, walk, encounter, fight, gain EXP, level up, open the gate by touching the switch somewhere else until you reach the end. This is tedious work, even for people who get used to JRPG grinding. But the pace of the battle is very good. It really comforts me that the encounter and battle won't take long with such good speeding and pacing. When you master the hotkeys, maybe each encounter battle will last for only 10-20 seconds or so. Also, small mechanics like stealing sometimes encouraged player to explore and encounter more in order to get some rare items from the enemy. The game is also very generous in the providing of items. Discovering and opening tons of boxes in the dungeon is also one of the most exciting moments in the game. This game has a huge amount of items to acquire. Besides some regular HP MP items, there are also materials for different xianshu in the game, and items that are super efficient against a particular enemy, and items with special functionality, like the Earth Ball can exit a dungeon immediately. The main character can steal items from the enemy, and each enemy will bear items that only this kind of monster may have. But the best part of the game is not the graphics and of course not the battle system. The reason that people voted for this game 7 years after its release, and the reason people are still talking about it today is, yes, the story. You play as Li Xiaoyao, a young man living carefree in a small town in southern China. One day, the aunt that looked after him since childhood got seriously sick, and he sailed to an island in search of elixir, where he met a girl in a dramatic way who lived there for 10 years. He got the medicine, but it turns out that bandits followed him to the island. One thing after another, he decides to travel across China to find this girl's parents, and the story begins. Like many JRPGs, it has a road movie structure, and after each smaller chapter in each town, you finally reach the climax of the story. The story touches on some special topics like love between humans and demons. Does the demon have the right to life in human society? And cultures of Miao people who use the bugs a lot in daily life and fighting. The whole story of the game is also well structured and explained. It just makes sense, which is very valuable in my opinion. Besides the classic wuxia foundation of the story, it added a lot of character building and world-shaping dialogues in the game that made every game character memorable. And that's why some of the plot of the game feels so strong and heartbreaking because of the characters are constructed so well. Their aura of existence become essential to players. The feeling of experiencing Sword and Fairy is very unique. As a JRPG player for many years, I know there are definitely better RPGs out there, but the position of Sword and Fairy in my heart is just irreplaceable. The story of the game is so famous that the game has actually been made into a TV show with the same name. Some of you might know these very famous Chinese TV stars like Liu Yifei and Hu Ge. They're getting a lot of fame actually from the TV series. Although some game players are obviously not satisfied with the differences of the TV adaptation, there were still even more people who really love it and consider it now an outstanding TV show. People say it started an era of xuanhuan or xianxia trending in China, and it all begins right here from a video game IP. Oh, and how could I forget? The music of the game is phenomenal. The game was released with a CD sound version, and I could remember each piece of the soundtrack. town and cutscene pieces with its full Chinese-style chords and theme. They are just beautiful. One of the most famous songs from it is Butterfly Love. You can see tons of fan-made music pieces according to the rhythm, even orchestral versions. Yes, 1995. It's a special year for RPG players. It's quite late in the 16-bit console dynasty. We are having our one and only Chrono Trigger, and excellent JRPGs like Tales of Phantasia. But even comparing with classics at that level, I believe that Sword and Fairy still can find its highlights and valuable features here and there. I would highly recommend it to any hardcore JRPG fans to try out this game. Maybe you'd better follow a map guide during the dungeon part to optimize your experience, and trust me, you will not regret it. For casual RPG fans, I'm also preparing a recap of the story of the whole game, and hopefully you can get some essence of the story from it. I also recommend people who've already played it to also watch the next recap edition to pick up your memories too. Alright, that's the end of the part 1, some simple introduction of Sword and Fairy, and hopefully you can get the charming points of the game. If you like more videos like this, talking about hidden gems you may never have played or even heard of from the east part of the world, please like, subscribe, and write your thoughts in the comment section below. And this is Lunamos, a Chinese player living in Japan, making English retro game reviews. See you next time.